College football nerds here doing a weekend recap for you and kind of a state of the union in college football headed into week 12, which is a really weak slate. We want to discuss a lot of the big games that happened this past weekend, talk about Miami, Georgia Tech, talk about Alabama, LSU, Georgia losing to Ole Miss, all of that, playoff picture and everything. So this might just be a fun talking ball, rambling type of show from us. You get a few of those from us every year. I got Josh with me. We're going to get nerdy with y'all. All right, Josh, let's start with Miami. Miami had flirted with disaster all season. We've been pretty critical of them because they're flirting with disaster against much weaker opponents than a lot of the teams in the Big Ten, a lot of teams in the SEC, and they're still barely winning these games. And we have always had this sort of baked-in mentality that we act like we don't do, but we really do in college football collectively, and that's watch the loss column. If you've got a clean number in that loss column, a 0 or a 1, we're going to keep you kind of high as possible. We're not going to look at, close wins against bad teams or whatever. But once you get that first loss, I think that's when people start judging all of those other wins. And it kind of looked like that's what happened with Miami. I think they dropped down to 12th. Talk a little bit about sort of that game in the context of the rest of the season for Miami so far this year.
Yeah, I mean, really set me up to be positive, Daniel.
Yes, that's what the people come here for. So
yeah. Well, I mean, the reality is there's a reason why Miami fell to 12th, and that reality is that Miami has not gotten it done for weeks now in terms of what you would expect from a team that's a playoff-bound team. 12th in the playoffs, realize is not a playoff team in reality because you're probably going to have a G5 that's going to jump into the 12th slot. So you really need to be top 11. I mean, my thing with Miami is pretty simple. Miami has not consistently beaten teams they should beat. And more importantly, they've consistently struggled to beat teams that they should be beating by a large margin. And I felt like for a little bit there, we thought maybe we're past that, the Virginia Tech, Cal, Louisville stretch where they really struggled to win each one of those 3 games. I'm looking right now offensively. I mean, they've been fantastic. They're 7.6 yards per play. In that stretch, they were right at their average, 7.3, 6.7, 7.5 yards per play. Actually got slowed down more by Florida State than I think people realized. The problem has been defense, right? They were giving up 6 to 8 yards per play in those. And Daniel, we've talked about this a lot in games. If you have a quarterback, you have 2 teams playing, right? And you have one quarterback at 9 yards per attempt and one quarterback at 13 in a game. It's amazing how often the 9 yards will beat the 13 yards. And the reason for that is once you get past a certain level of offense, one team is just scoring faster than the other team is scoring, but they're both scoring every time. And the problem with Miami in this game in particular is, they only allowed 28 points, but they finally ran into a game where basically the offense made enough mistakes at the wrong times to cause themselves to stall. 436 yards of offense. They outgained Georgia Tech by 60 yards, but they were 3 of 10 on third down. Crucial to the whole game, 1 of 4 on fourth down. Had the strip sack at the end of the game, basically eliminating the heroics that had won them the prior games. This was Miami looking like the team that they had flirted with being all year. And as I do this live, in our rating system, Miami's sitting there at 11th. So this is the Miami that we thought they were. It's the Miami our computers think they are. They are not a bad team. They are a good team, but they are a good team with a bad defense. They are a good team with, I do think, the best quarterback in the country, but he's the best quarterback in the country and one of the best running backs, I will say, trying to do way too much by themselves. And everything else like receiver, tight end, whatnot, especially in offense, they're good, but they're not elite. And when you combine them with the defense, it's just not effective enough. They deserve to be dropped. And Daniel, I'm going to spin this back around to you. Given the fact that this felt like something that had been coming all year, is this a little bit of an indictment on the fact that they were ever ranked that hard to start with, right? Is this just something that where they should have been and we finally were allowed to accept the reality of what Miami has been all year, which is a team in the top 20 but not a top 10 team? Or do you really buy the fact that when they're undefeated, because they're undefeated, they had to be top 5 until they weren't?
No, I mean, we've we've done top 10s this year where they were undefeated. I didn't have them in my top 10. I think you've done the same. I'd ask the same question about BYU. BYU's 9-0, but they were clinging to their life in a rivalry game against a bad Utah team. They've had a lot of these close near misses, and they haven't beaten anybody. And this is the problem that we have with misaligned schedules and misaligned conferences, in that I think BYU is a good story. I think a Miami that makes the playoffs this year because the ACC is down is still a good story, but making the playoffs because you get an auto bid and an auto buy into the playoffs as a conference champion of a weak conference is not the same as we should rank you highly among everyone in the nation. What do we always talk about with people who have complained in the past that the SEC got two teams into the BCS championship or into the conference, the college football playoffs? People would always say, "Well, that's not fair. These every conference championship should matter." They matter to that region and to that conference. That doesn't necessarily impart a level of quality that's equal to their peers. Right now, I think Oregon, Ohio State would be probably a 2-score favorite over a Miami, probably closer to 20 points over a BYU. And so we're looking at a Big 12 whose biggest win of the season is 18-15 over SMU, and an SMU team that's kind of run through the ACC for the most part, which should tell you something because SMU wasn't great last year. I think they lost to several middling Power 5 teams. So to answer your question, no, I don't think that you have to rank. We don't have to pretend we don't see what we see. And so we don't have to pretend these teams are good in a national ranking, which is different from saying you get in the playoffs because you won your conference. I'm okay with that. I'm not okay with auto buys, but I am okay with putting a Miami or a Clemson or an SMU or whatever in the playoffs. That's different. We'll seed when we get there, but that doesn't mean I have to put Miami ahead of an Alabama or an Ole Miss.
Yeah. Speaking of Ole Miss, to move to the next
hard segue.
Segue off a cliff. Too soon. Georgia Ole Miss. We had the preview of that game. As I recall, you picked Georgia. I picked Ole Miss. I had this long conversation about how there was everything from a common sense, common understanding perspective, I think, that said that Georgia was a better team, even if you thought Ole Miss was going to win. And I kept rattling through the things that were really bothering me about that perception, not the least of which was the fact that our computer model has Georgia, what were they, 13th in our computer? Our computers have not loved them all year. They have Texas number 1, Ohio State number 2, Oregon number 5, Indiana number 4, Alabama number 6. But they had Ole Miss 3 and had them 3 and think they had Georgia 13, fell to 15th. Our computer was pretty well convinced that Ole Miss was just the better team going into this matchup. Ole Miss looked like the better team in that game. I picked Ole Miss outright to win because of all that, noting the fact that I thought the point spread was inviting people to pick Georgia based on the common perception. And there were just a lot of things about the way they matched up stylistically. The fact that they really hadn't played good all-around football for Georgia all year. But it was still a weird game, Daniel, and I'll let you talk about it. But, Georgia had 245 yards of offense total in the whole game, which is almost shocking after kind of coming out on fire. Ole Miss had 397. The thing that struck me when we did the preview, which turned out to be extremely accurate, was the fact that in our metrics, Ole Miss right now is the number 2 rush defense in the country. And sure enough, Georgia was held to 1.8 yards per carry. They could not run the ball whatsoever. Ole Miss was held to 3.7, but they still at least got 100 yards rushing. And I think that one-dimensionality to Georgia just broke them. And I also felt like the offensive line for Georgia got exposed. When I talk about things that Vegas sees that we don't see, Georgia had a real problem with pure speed rush on the edge, and that is one of those things where if you break in that regard, it breaks the whole offense. I did not think Beck played poorly in this particular game. I did not put much on Beck. Even the interception was not really to me, due to him. It was due to the pressure of the line, the fact they were batting balls and getting pressure. This just seemed like a game where it wasn't even a buzzsaw to me, Daniel. That's the striking thing. This was a game where Georgia has been a flawed team, and they were flawed in the wrong ways for what Ole Miss was, and it came out. And I think this result, maybe it was more lopsided because it was at Ole Miss, but this result just kind of was what it was.
I'm with you. Carson Beck is taking a lot of the heat right now, but I have seen some frustrations from Georgia fans bubble up on Twitter, rightly so, about the offensive line, because the offensive line was a problem, both run game and pass game. But Josh, this also comes back to another thing that you've touched on for a couple of years now. If you watch this game, what you would see, if you saw Ole Miss receivers playing in this game, you would think they were the Georgia receivers. They were the five-star city. They were the team that's been multiple national championships recently. Georgia just doesn't have any game breakers at wide receiver. It's skill players in general. I think Etienne's still not 100%. But if you look at that team and you accept what you saw with your eyes in terms of the offensive line play, there's still two other potential negatives here. One of them is they couldn't shake anything up and just try to get the ball to skill guys in space because they don't have any game breakers there. And I do also feel like Bobo called a weird game. I think he gets into a rut a little bit in some of these games and doesn't do enough creative to stress test the opposite side of the field, his defensive opponent. And I think all of that coalesced in this game. The 28 points for Ole Miss, honestly, you should probably beat Ole Miss if they score 28 points. And I know that's a little bit not respecting the fact that they're more of a defensive-minded team this year, but if you're an elite team, you need to be scoring. And I think some of that 28 came from the ineptitude on offense. Josh, did this game firmly solidify in your mind the thing that you've been saying for a while about their skill players? And also, what are you starting to feel or have you felt about Bobo in this Georgia offense?
Well, again, setting me up to be super positive. I think if you're a Georgia fan and you're watching this video and you felt like I've been overly critical, hopefully you respect the fact that a lot of the criticisms I've had for Georgia over the past few years, especially this year, have come home to roost. I try to see things as I see them. Sometimes I'm wrong. I try to own it when I'm wrong. I haven't been wrong on this. I haven't been wrong on this for years. The one thing I was really wrong on a few years ago was I said there's no way you can run an offense through Bowers. Still kind of true, right? They weren't overly explosive, but he was such a uniquely generational prospect that he ended up the exception to that rule. And I think we're realizing right now, because of the NFL, he was the exception to the rule. And Daniel, that is something that I think is particularly striking when you look at how high McConkey went in the draft and how high Bowers went, and the fact that they're both being utilized a lot immediately in the NFL as rookies. I talk a lot in the offseason going into the season. It is not necessarily a positive when you have guys go higher in the draft than you expect for your future projections as a football team in college, because that's saying the NFL looked at the guys that Georgia lost and said, no, those offensive players that everybody thought were just journeymen are actually true impact NFL guys. And that was, frankly, should have been a bad sign to Georgia fans of what this team is, because that's saying, look, this offense and everything they were doing and the fact that they were super efficiency and not very explosive, and the fact that they had an expert quarterback, a super veteran quarterback in Bennett to run it for years, that offense had elite tools. And a lot of what Beck was last year was still a guy throwing to McConkey and Bowers, and he wasn't the same guy towards the end of the year when they were banged up. This year, you've got Lovett, who's a transfer. I think he's a good receiver. I think he's just a good receiver. Dylan Bell, who I think has a higher ceiling, and he's shown flashes, but he's not all the way there. I also don't know that he's great in short yardage separation. We've talked a lot about how Arian Smith is not a complete wide receiver right now. Very talented. 2 or 3 interceptions in the year have been caused by him running the wrong route, including a key one in the Alabama game, arguably lost him the game. It is what it is. And so they've kind of tried to go back to leaning on backs and tight ends in the passing game. And look, you don't have Brock Bowers right now. You don't have the running backs you had a few years ago. They're not good enough to do that and carry you in the same way. And even the thing that's striking to me is Trevor Etienne has been less effective at Georgia than he'd been at Florida. So I think all around you have to really self-evaluate. It's clear recruiting has not gotten it done on the offensive side of the ball. There are not playmakers on that side of the ball as need to be to maintain their success. It's clear to me, too, that the scheme is too antiquated. It is too easy in college football to scheme ways for things to happen, and they are unable to do it. The offensive line is not playing it anywhere near what I think people would expect for the talent level. There's a lot of soul searching. Now, I think Kirby Smart's a phenomenal coach. I think he's going to find a way to rectify these things in a few years. But Georgia is not where they expected to be. This is a major rebuilding year for them. And it's something of a troubling year, too, because a lot of these issues aren't even youth. The issues are bad evaluations and a lack of talent at certain positions. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, we're going to do a preview of the Georgia-Tennessee game. So, Daniel, I'm going to stop there, and we can pick up a little bit with the Tennessee game where it is. But I will say, Georgia-Tennessee is going to be a huge deal for this program, because if Georgia loses that game and falls to 9-3, they are probably out of the playoff. And the run of dominance that Georgia had, which was a bit spoiled by Alabama last year in the SEC title, and I'm just going to say it so it's on record, I think if Georgia was healthy versus Alabama, they win the national title last year. And I just say that from a program trajectory standpoint. That's a thing that happens. That's football. That's realistic. It's not an excuse. It also doesn't take away anything from Alabama. But they were at the point where the only thing keeping them from winning titles is injuries, which is where most elite teams are at some level. That is not where they are this year. It's kind of the first chink in the armor for Smart, and we'll see if it continues or where it ends up.
And I don't know how many people realize if they didn't look into the numbers, but even the Texas win, which was seemingly dominant, Beck threw for 4.3 yards per attempt, which is really failing football. Not just bad, that is really bad. And they ran for 3.6 yards per carry. Those numbers don't equate with 30 points. They only had one drive over 35 yards, one scoring drive over 35 yards. It's just that Texas was even more inept, and they were just in shambles that whole time, which is an interesting note given what you said about maybe some of this RPO stuff really locking down what defenses are doing now. All right, let's talk a little bit Alabama, LSU. Going into that game, what we said in the preview, you picked Alabama, I picked LSU, but I said some of it is me not knowing about this stretch run that Alabama had that was brutal, that included the Tennessee loss. I didn't know how much they were affected by that and if they would come out really rejuvenated and maybe healthier out of the bye. I think a lot of that came to fruition against LSU. One of the other things I said, and this is what I want you to talk about, one of the other things that I said that I was waiting to see was we felt like at the beginning of the season that this Alabama defense was really well set up to defend a more pro-style attack, because that's where offenses are headed, and that's kind of what it felt like they were tooled up to be. The problem is they hadn't faced a lot of those types of offenses throughout the year to showcase that was an actual strength. Do you think that this game, with finally a healthy quarterback on the other side of the ball, what's your takeaway from that in terms of how you feel this defense, when healthy, is made to defend a real solid pro-style attack?
Well, I'll clarify a little bit, because I think my point has been, and where my mind is at with that, is it's not so much pro-style as it is a more traditional offense, which could be RPO-based, and in some ways I think is almost better geared for RPO-based. And I'm not even talking about Alabama specifically. It goes back to the point we just made about Georgia. These modern zone-heavy, pressure-based schemes are designed to take away offenses that try to be overly vertical and be very aggressive in the passing game. And we saw that on an end-zone interception. LSU threw 2 interceptions in this game. Nussmeier's thrown a really inordinate amount of interceptions. If you try to be a gunslinger and you are not trying to process post-snap, these defenses will make you pay, because what they're doing is they're disguising pre-snap what they're doing. They're dropping a lot of guys into coverage, or bringing pressure without much predictability. And they're doing some kind of exotic things in the back end and where the zones sit and fall. So if you go pre-snap, snap the ball, say I say 2 guys, I'm going to throw the cover 2 beater, and you let it rip, the odds are every so often they're going to rotate, and what you think is a cover 2 beater, they go to cover 3, the guy's center of field, and you throw it right to a safety. You must read post-snap. You must take your time in the pocket, and it does 2 things. One, longer in the pocket means higher sack rates, which means the pressure side of it is more effective. And 2, it means if you are a gunslinger, which is what Nussmeier is, he does not spend enough time evaluating where he's throwing the ball, and he throws a lot of interceptions. And as he's tried to scale that down, what's happening is his yard per attempt goes just kind of in the toilet. 5.7 yards per attempt in this game. He threw for 239 yards, but he did it on 42 pass attempts. That is not a good average. And the thing is, in terms of what they faced before, Daniel, what I would say is Alabama had faced a weirdly high number of highly mobile quarterbacks and odd offenses. And I think what we're seeing with these modern schemes is that they do have real problems with mobile quarterbacks. By the way, good segue, hard segue, soft segue. And that contrasts what Alabama did in this game with Jalen Milroe. That LSU's defense has been hugely improved, but there are 3 games where they got lit up offensively. The first one was against Sellers. South Carolina would have beaten them if Sellers had not gotten hurt. We could have a long rant about South Carolina in the rankings. South Carolina is a much better team than they're getting credit for. They're one of the better teams right now in the SEC. I think pretty clearly, having stomped Vanderbilt pretty good. And after having thumped Texas A&M, I don't know why they're not getting their due. But had Sellers not gotten hurt, they would have won. And Ashford for South Carolina was pretty terrible when he came in. And so, that gets put aside. Then they're beating Texas A&M, make the switch to Marcel Reed, and LSU cannot stop Marcel Reed. Alabama comes in. Jalen Milroe has 185 yards rushing on 12 carries. That's 15 yard per carry average. I think there is something to be said that these schemes, because they're zone-based, you play more on your heels. You're designed to catch the passing game. They are more susceptible to the run in general, I think, than other schemes because they're a little more passive. The way they stop the run is being aggressive at attacking gaps to the line of scrimmage. But when you play effective quarterback run games, what those do is they give you numbers advantages in the box. So if you're overly aggressive shooting gaps, a quarterback that knows how to do the reads properly in the zone read can try to make sure the ball does not go towards the blitz. A team like Alabama, which was a more quarterback power, they don't do as many reads. Milroe's not great at them. What they do is called power runs behind running backs. They kill them, but the reason is they get numbers. And those defenders are all falling back. The offensive players are attacking the line of scrimmage. They attack, Alabama goes by them, and if they catch them off the blitz, he's the second level, and he was gone by the time the defenders turn their heads. They can't catch him. So, I do think what Alabama is doing showed that they are really good at stopping a more traditional offense, which LSU was. But LSU got a taste of the problem Alabama's had, which is when you face a highly mobile quarterback, a lot of those advantages of these new defensive schemes, I think, go away. And ironically, the thing that had recently fallen away, zone read-based quarterback run offenses in the past 2 years had fallen off. Suddenly, I think it become more potent. And more or less obliterated LSU in this game because of how well Milroe was able to run the football.
It was interesting to see that, Milroe had at one point he had 190 yards, and it was really like through 3 quarters. He was gashing them, didn't have to throw a whole lot, which I think is good. We saw an Alabama team against Tennessee where they ran more of a just pass-first pro-style offense. Milroe wasn't running well or that much, and they were highly ineffective. Now, that's a better offense. But what's really interesting to me is Kane Womack has decided to, in big games at least, run a high-pressure scheme. And yes, Herbstreit pointed out in the broadcast that they'll show 7 and bail 3 out of that. But a lot of times they run a lot of zero. They run a lot of situations where they just trust their corners, and safeties are coming, or safeties are within 3-4 yards of line of scrimmage playing run. Like there was one play they showed the overhead view. I think it was on a sack, and they sent almost everybody, and everybody was still covered. And to me, that's interesting because the narrative coming into the season was these corners are not, they're all young, they're not going to be very good. And we have seen the coverage bust, but there's got to be some level of trust there, given how many times we haven't seen just a one-off nickel blitz when we're watching an Alabama football game. We're seeing 7-8 guys. And just as an aside, Josh, I want to point this out. Brian Kelly in his post-game press conference was complaining about Alabama sending 7 guys on their last possession. And I thought this was – I'm usually a big defender of his, but I thought this was ridiculous given that Alabama had already put in their entire backup offense, and then there were second and third string guys out there on defense, and he's throwing the ball every play, finally scored with 11 seconds left with his full starting staff. Full starting cast. You're down 42-6, throwing the ball every play, trying to get some glamour touchdown at the end, and you're mad that they're letting their third team guys blitz you and not playing man up like it's a spring game. I thought that was a little petty. Give me your take on that.
Well, there's not a lot to disagree with. I mean, having Nussmeier out there throwing the football down 42-6 with 30 seconds left is inexcusable. And he got banged up.
Yep.
He was limping off the field. It was stupid. It reminded me, I mean, it happened a few years ago, I feel like, one of those Alabama LSU games where it was Mettenberger. Famously, there's like a gif of him like crawling off the field, I remember. There was no excuse for that. They needed to pull their starters. And to your point, and Kelly's bad about that. I really like Kelly as a coach. I think he's a sound coach. I think he's, I lauded him as the right fit for LSU for what they needed. But he does throw guys under the bus. Maybe not, I don't know if he or Hugh Freeze is worse. There's a lot of that going around in the SEC at times. But that in particular, you cannot on one hand keep your starters out and say we're going to play our offense to the end of the game and play to score and play to win, and then fault the other team for putting in their third string and then running them to win the game. And I mean, maybe his complaint was they were just playing to injure, not playing to win. But it was actually the most effective thing Alabama did with their backups because they were struggling on that last drive to play straight up defense. So they said, okay, we're just going to bring a lot of pressure because we got athletic kids that don't know what they're doing, and we're just going to play man up and pressure. But to the point you made earlier, this was an interesting game, and I want to round out with a couple things. One, I had said that I was picking Alabama to win because of the injury situation in those two teams. I was a bit surprised LSU was not as banged up as I expected. Like, Weeks played and looked fine. But the Dellinger injury on the offensive line, I think, really did hurt them. There's just that many more pieces missing to get a good run game, to get good pass pro. Alabama's offensive line looked much better healthy, especially with Roberts healthy at right guard, who got hurt again. Defensively, too, Alabama has been a mash unit. We talked about in the preview. They lost the Tennessee game in part because they had a third-string nickel playing, and he got beat a couple times. They had the starter back out there in that game, and they were much more effective. When they've had all their starting defensive backs, they've been a good defense. And at times a very, very good defense. Now that starting nickel back got hurt again in this game. They suffered, their top pass rusher I just saw a ticker that he was lost for the season, Robinson. So they're banged up again. I'm not sure what that means going forward. But the health of their offense and defenses, I flagged that as why I was picking Alabama. I think that did end up being true. I do think this is a game where Alabama did sort of dominate, but it ran away from LSU, I think, in part because of these small things, because of these little differences. And the last thing I want to say, though, Daniel, is regard to There's a lot of crowing about how much he's improved and how much this is an on game. But to your point about Georgia versus Texas, Milroe threw for 6.1 yards per attempt. He only threw for 109 yards in the game, 12 of 18 passing. They killed LSU on the ground with 300 yards rushing, where LSU caved. This was a team that I heard from SEC coaches all year. We talked about in the preview. Can you play football without a defensive line? That had been the tagline. And the answer is it looks like you can't. But from a passing perspective, I thought they held their own. Alabama did not really, they had 3 deep balls and hit none of them. They didn't really allow Alabama to do much of anything downfield. So I do think the jury's still out on both teams. Much like the Ole Miss Georgia game, they were both in rainstorms that colors things quite a bit. But Alabama looked more complete, looked more functional. Milroe looked more confident. But under the surface, they didn't throw the ball any better than they have. In fact, in some ways, this was one of the worst passing performances of the year. So to me, it still leaves a lot of question marks on the table for Alabama and what they are in view of all the different factors. Injuries going forward, the fact that I don't know that this proved they solved the passing equation. And that's important because they're going to play better offenses, play better defenses, and really, really good defenses are not going to let you beat them running the football. That is the one thing you can consistently stop if you put your mind to it. They've got to be able to pass the football at a high level if they actually want to be a national title team.
I will say if he hits on that deep ball, which did hit Ryan Williams in the hands, and it was a rainstorm, or that Kendrick Law crosser, if he hits those 2 that were good throws, it jumps to 9.5 yards per attempt. So I do think that the run game was there. To me, it was less about having to see a lot from Jalen Milroe in the passing game and more about having a level of cohesiveness in how that offense was running and how he didn't feel. The Tennessee game, watching him just walk up to the line, do the checks, like he would walk up and do checks with like 7 seconds left on the clock. The overall exasperation that it seemed like he was giving, that did not seem to be the case in this game at all. Even I noticed the very first play, they got the false start, and he was clapping, like high energy clapping next to the ref, like I'm good, like no emotion, like scared or frustrated or anything like that. Everything just felt a lot smoother. My thing is, this game, nobody's beaten LSU like this. And this is the kind of thing, what I said in the preview, that we haven't seen from Alabama in years is their ability to put the defense and the offense together in the same game. And for once, I think it's been since 2020 for a lot of it. You see it, and it's got to be good if you're an Alabama fan. All right, Josh, this one's run a little long. We've got some good games that we covered here. I want to remind everybody we're doing a separate top 12. But before we do that, do you want to put a bow on this one?
Yeah, I just want to run through in like one statement, cover a lot of the games we didn't cover because there are a lot of smaller ones. Oregon's continuing to run. Ohio State beat Purdue the way you would expect to beat Purdue. I thought they still looked a little off kilter to start that game, but that happens to every team. Texas, Florida is interesting, Daniel, right? I mean, the week after they come out and say, we're not letting Napier go. He's our coach for the year. Texas comes out and just cleans their clock. And that's, I think, flowing under the radar that Ewers was banged up with that abdominal injury, came back against Georgia, and he looks like a different player, and they look like a different football team because of it against Florida. And that's a Florida team that had been playing well. So, you do kind of wonder now if Texas had not been in that situation against Georgia and Ewers had been playing, if maybe they'd be undefeated and we'd be looking at a lot of things differently. Penn State, Washington, Tennessee, Mississippi State kind of have the same vibe to me in that those weren't really great opponents. Indiana, Michigan is a fascinating one to me because, and I watched a lot of that game, Indiana looked like a team that was very mortal against reasonably good teams. And Michigan is not a good team. And that was a struggle for Indiana. And I say that because their schedule is, Daniel, there's no sugarcoating it, is terrible. Indiana's schedule is terrible. Going into that Ohio State game in 2 weeks, which we will almost certainly do a preview for, assuming nothing comes up in our personal lives. They've blown out Michigan State, Washington, Nebraska, Northwestern. We talk about this a lot. You got to blow out your bad opponents. They played a Michigan team that's actually a top 40-ish team, I think, in our metrics. And, I'm going to look up right now because I don't even know that they're that high. But they're probably still the best team they've played. With Nebraska and Michigan even. And, they didn't look great. Didn't look great. Michigan, if they'd had anything remotely resembling competent quarterback play, would have won that game. Warren was horrible. So, there's a lot of stuff running down the board where, Boise State 21 Nevada. Iowa State gets knocked out again. Iowa State was a team that, as of a couple weeks ago, we were talking about college football playoff, Big 12 champion. They played a couple better-ish teams in Texas Tech and Kansas and dropped them both. So the schedule isolation thing is real. And, it's kind of fascinating. Even Missouri 30-23 over Oklahoma just confirms to me that they're not much better than an Oklahoma second tier. They are a product of their schedule. There's a lot of teams floating around right now that are products of their schedule that we're not going to talk about even, necessarily in the top 12 at much detail, but we will, at some level talk about it. But it was fascinating how many of them, the ones that just excelled, like Texas, and you compare it to others like Indiana that did not. And I'm going to have to be a lot more critical of these games because the schedule disparity is just insane between some of these teams and some of the 2 or 3 loss SEC teams. And, the Big Ten isn't deep enough is the problem to be in this situation. It's not so much the SEC is better, just the schedules are more consistent. It's making it hard to evaluate.
All right, y'all. Let us know in the comments what was your biggest takeaway from the weekend and maybe who you are thinking is going to sneak into the playoffs based on the direction that everybody's heading. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. Keep an eye out for the top 10 video and the preview coming at the end of the week. And God bless.